Well, good morning, good morning, good morning, and welcome to the latest in our LinkedIn Live sessions about leadership influence. We're just going to give people 2 or 3 minutes to join us. In the meantime, whilst we're waiting for people to rock up, then you might just want to take a look at this little list we've put together of where we could be heading today, the results we could be sort of trying to reach for. This is a flip side of the list we had at the beginning of the last session, which was all about influence poverty. And we will be returning to that very shortly. But it is, of course, our list. We came up with our original list of influence poverty items 29, 30 years ago. And what's fascinating is that it has hardly changed at all in that time, despite the great leaps forward that internal communication has made. So this list is still kind of relevant for a lot of people, it would appear, but we're not saying that this is necessarily how it would look to you. You're going to have your own list. You may already have documented your own list. We don't know, but this is how we kind of see some of the advantages, as it were, of having all the influence you desire. And today we're going to be looking at how to make this and anything else you want actually happen. So we're going to just make the assumption, because this is so unlike Zooms or Teams or anything. We don't know who's on this call, so we have to just sort of kind of wing it, as we're not winging it, but we just sort of have to guess who's here. So it would be a good idea if you want to say hi in the comments, just to let us know that you are actually here. That would be great. So we will have some kind of idea of who's here and who isn't. And also, as we go through the session, then you will be able to ask questions and make comments and so on as we go, so that we can answer them. Any questions you've got, because there are actually, when it comes to this whole issue of getting all the influence you want and how we back your leaders into an empowering corner, there are actually anytime people come up with lists, we always get really frustrated. If we used to have a boss who was sort of saying, well, could you make it 10 or could you make it 5, or could you whatever? And we got frustrated because we thought, well, actually, no, there aren't 10. There are 8 items here. Oh, yeah, but can you make it 10? Because it will look neater. And we always get frustrated. It sounded sort of artificial, which is why we were kind of a bit fed up when we realized that when it comes to the steps to back your leaders into an empowering corner, there are actually 10 of them. So we will go through them, and after each one, we will pause and take questions, and or look at any comments you want to make. And it's quite possible there may be no comments or no questions, in which case we will just sort of crack on. But we do want you to feel that you can contribute to this if you want, and that you can get your questions answered as we go. Obviously, time permitting. One of the other things that we think is really important to acknowledge is the fact that we have a blind spot. Remember last time we talked a lot about blind spots, and we have a blind spot, of course, when it comes to your personal agenda. Why are you here? It could just be that you've seen something on LinkedIn and you thought, oh, that sounds interesting. So you're just here for the crack, as our Celtic forebears would have said it. But it may be that you're here because you have a personal agenda. You have a desire to actually get the influence that you want. You're fed up with the current situation and so on. And so you want that for yourself. That's another possibility. And a third possibility, of course, is actually your boss wants you to make some changes. They want you to have more influence. There's a corporate agenda that's at play. We don't know what that is, why you're here, what you want to get out of this session. We also, because we don't know what your situation is, we don't know how easy it would be if you want to do something with these ideas later on. If it's something that, if you're doing it just for yourself, it might be a case of, well, yeah, I've got all I need and I can crack on and do it. In which case we will be delighted to hold your coat, stand on the sidelines and cheer you on with a hearty, you go girl or boy or whatever. Or it might be that you sort of think, well, I'd love to do this, but I'm not sure I've got the headspace, or I haven't got the time or whatever to actually do it, in which case you might appreciate a little bit of a helping hand. So rather than leave you high and dry at the end, we will just briefly talk about how, if you would like a helping hand, we might be able to provide it. Okay, so with that as our sort of as our background, we will, in fact, unlike last time, we are going to be using a lot of slides in this session, and there are people who say that you should never use bullet points in slides. Well, we're not absolutely certain about that because, well, for a couple of reasons. First of all, because nowadays it seems an awful lot of particularly younger people want to have the captions on at the bottom of the screen when they're watching a film and so on, and their parents, apparently there are now loads and loads of family arguments that are going on. Turn those captions off. I don't want to read this film, I want to watch it. And so it seems that some people do actually like having things that they can read at the same time as listening. And also, we're a big fan of Richard Osman's House of Games. And that program is almost entirely him sitting there reading stuff that's up on the screen. So we will be doing a lot of bullet points in our slides. And hey, we think it's probably an easier way for you to take on board the information we're going to be sharing. So with that in mind, let's crack on with the first of our steps to enable you to get to where you want to be. Now, the first couple of steps are things you may already have done if you were in on the first session that we did last month, because what we're looking at is, first of all, the whole issue of step one, documenting your current influence poverty. What does that look like? We went through this last time, and you may already have documented your influence poverty. If you have done and you'd like to let us know how you got on with that, then that would be great, because what we discovered last time was this sort of nonsense that, as we said, we documented best part of 3 decades ago. And it's just bear in mind what that means. That was before the word intranet had even been coined. That's how long ago we wrote this. There was no such thing as enterprise social networks. It was so kind of antiquated, and yet the same problems that people were facing then, many are still facing today. So even though internal communication has sort of come on in leaps and bounds, well, has it really? In some respects, yes. In other respects, no. So it'd be a good idea, because this is just our list, for you to document your list. What are all the frustrations and niggles and the if-onlys and so on that you face that you would like to address if you had all the influence you desire? The second thing, of course, is to then flip that on its head, as we have done, by saying, okay, if you don't want all that rubbish, what do you want instead? How do you want your working life to be? What would influence abundance actually look like for you? So this is the second part of step one, as it were, to get all that sort of documented, get it out in the open, so it's not just sort of hanging around in your head, so you can get clear about it. And then you can think about the fact that, well, a lot of people, when we share this with them, they look at it and they say, oh, wow, that would be like living the dream. It would be absolutely amazing if this was how my life was. Well, hold that thought. If this would be living the dream for you, we'll come back to that idea a little bit later on and see how else you might be able to think about it. So what else do we need to do? Well, we also need to, as well as documenting what you want things to look like, to write down, okay, what would be in it for you? Why do you want to do this? You have to be motivated to do this. So saying, all right, if I had all this influence, this is what would be in it for me, but not just me. This is not a selfish thing. What's in it for your organization? And also, what's in it for your leaders? Why should they back you? What's going to be in it for them? So it's really useful to document all this, get it all out in the open, so that you know why you actually want to do this and what's in it, and some of the ways in which you can sell it in to your leadership team. But hopefully you shouldn't need to do too much selling in. It should be pretty straightforward. So let's just pause for a moment and see, are there any comments or questions about what we've talked about in that first session, in that first step? Let's see if we can see any comments. We're still kind of getting used to this technology. So let's see if we have any comments that have been shared so far. There don't appear to be any. Not okay. In that case, we will crack on with step 2. So what does step 2 involve? Step 2 is about sharing a definition of internal communication, that valid definition. This is what we spent so much of last time talking about, how to come up with a valid definition of internal communication. So you're actually starting from the same place. Everyone's starting from the same place, and that same place is the right place to be starting from. And we defined internal communication last time as being all communication that goes on inside an organization, which directly or indirectly enables that organization to fulfill its reason for existing. That's how we defined it. But what are the implications of that? Well, a couple of really major implications of defining internal communication in this way. First of all, it is the only business activity that everybody does. You know, not everyone manages budgets or people or IT systems or anything like that, but everybody communicates with, at least with their boss, usually with their colleagues and other peers. Internal communication is unique in that respect. Not only that, it also influences the quality and efficiency of every other business activity. And that is absolutely key. When you can get your leadership team to just accept that definition of internal communication, accept that one way or another, all sorts of different forms of internal communication are influencing the quality and efficiency of every other business activity, then you're in a position to back them into that empowering corner with this simple question. Given that every single business activity in this organization is being influenced by the quality of internal communication, do you want to have justifiable confidence in the way it's being conducted, or do you want to have to cross your fingers and hope it's going well? Which of those two would you like, leadership team? Now, we could be wrong about this, but we have a sense that it's very likely they're going to go for the justifiable confidence option. And as soon as they've done that, it's game over. You have backed them into an empowering corner. They may not realize it yet, and you may not realize how they've done so yet, but that's what we're going to be coming on to now. But what this does is it effectively flicks the first of a chain of dominoes. The others inevitably follow. And we'll explain to you how they do so, and how as soon as you've got them to say, we want justifiable confidence in how internal communication is conducted in this organization, it is effectively game over as far as them holding out on your leadership influence is concerned. Why is that the case? Well, in order to understand why that's the case, we need to do something now, which is perhaps going to be a little bit shocking or seem a little bit shocking, because we're going to suggest that in order for them to have justifiable confidence in the way internal communication practice is conducted in your organization, you are going to have to bin best practice. Yes, you did just hear us right. You're going to have to bin best practice, chuck it in the garbage where it belongs. And you might think, what on earth is this guy going on about? Well, it's worth bearing in mind that there is a distinction between, last time we talked about the difference between internal communication and internal communications. Similarly, there is a distinction between best practice and best practices. Now, many best practices may be absolutely fine. The problem is the concept of best practice. What is it? It's a label. So it is. Someone comes to you and says, this is best practice. Do they show you how they arrived at it? Do you know what the method was by which they came up with that best practice? Probably not. You're just supposed to accept that this is best practice because we say it is. Because best practice is not a specific method. It's a label that people stick on after they've done whatever method they've done that you don't usually get to see. And they're just presenting it to you as best practice. Which means if you can't see the method by which that best practice was arrived at, how can you have justifiable confidence in it? Well, you can't. Well, if you can't have justifiable confidence in the process by which this practice was developed, how are you supposed to have justifiable confidence in the products of that process? Again, it's absurd. So best practice as a concept isn't actually good enough, which is a weird thing to say because people would say, well, what could possibly be better than best? Well, let's explain what it is. Last time, we did a couple of things. We talked about a couple of things that we're going to reintroduce now. When it came to defining internal communication, we said that obviously that definition had to be a valid definition. Imagine working with an invalid definition. We also said that the purpose of internal communication needs to be valid, because if you're working with an invalid purpose of internal communication, then you'll have the most efficient and effective ways of producing the wrong results. So the purpose of internal communication has to be valid. It's not enough that it's just fit for purpose. It has to be fit for a valid purpose. And the other thing we talked about last time was the importance of showing your workings out, so everyone can see how you arrived at this. Only then is it going to be possible for them to have justifiable confidence in it. So what we are suggesting would be better than best practice as a concept is the concept of, we'll just summarize it for you here, TFVP, which stands for practices which are transparently fit for valid purposes. Now, why do we say purposes? Because people talk about things being fit for purpose. Yeah, that's another little cultural blind spot, because you will have a number of different practices in your job. You'll have a briefing process, you'll have a channel mix to manage, you'll have things to get signed off and approved, you'll have feedback systems, you'll have message calendar, all of those different practices. And each of them obviously needs to be designed in such a way that it is fit for the purpose of, let's say, the briefing process. So your briefing process needs to be fit for the briefing process. But it also needs to be fit for the purpose of internal communication. So each of your individual practices, you can start to validate the purpose of each of those by showing how does this particular practice design support the purpose of internal communication itself. Now, why does that matter? Why does TFVP enable you to back people into an empowering corner? Well, let's actually look at that empowering corner, because when it comes to the whole issue of fitness for purpose, part of the challenge is that people can very often use the word purpose and then come out with something that isn't actually a purpose at all. For example, you may recognize something along these lines, that you're sitting down with a client who's asked you to do some work for them. And you, let's say, for the sake of argument, for just to demonstrate the point, that if you were to say to them, okay, so what is the purpose of this communication? They're likely to say two things. First thing they're likely to say, in our experience, is, oh, that's a very good question. And then you say, okay, so give us a very good answer. And they will very often then say, right, okay, right, well, something along these lines. The purpose of this communication is to inform the employees about the product launch. So, well, they've used the word purpose, but hang on a second. just a minute. Is it valid? There is a very useful little hack that we worked out years and years and years ago. Anytime we hear the word purpose, is to follow it up with the question, okay, so what is the purpose of that purpose? In this case, what's the purpose of informing the employees about the product launch? Well, they haven't told us. Well, in that case, if we don't know what the purpose of informing them is, how can we know, first of all, which employees to inform, what information they're going to need, what they're supposed to do with it, when they're going to use it, where they're going to be at the time? We don't know any of that. So that so-called purpose turns out to be as good as useless. They might as well not have bothered. And that's why we have to go through this process of making sure that the purpose of anything that you're doing is valid. And the benefit of doing that is that it creates this paradigm in which only 4 possibilities can exist. Because it's transparent, everyone will be able to see that the purpose of any given practice you're using is valid or is invalid. And how fit is that practice for that purpose? They can see that it's either fit or it's unfit, which means that if you use the TFVP paradigm, that there are only 4 possibilities. Any practice that you are using which is not transparently fit for valid purposes must, by default, be either transparently unfit for valid purposes, transparently fit only for invalid purposes, or transparently unfit for invalid purposes. And your leaders say they want to have justifiable confidence in your practices. Which corner have they backed themselves into? If we offer them this paradigm, they don't really have any choice, do they? Or do they? Is the real world actually this simple, or is it a bit more complex? Because if you're eagle-eyed enough, you may have noticed there are a couple of arrows at the end of those axes. And they are there because, of course, in the real world, validity and fitness aren't actually black and white, are they? You know yourself that you could be, going to the gym to get fitter. And validity isn't even black and white necessarily. In that last example we gave you, where that client was saying the purpose of this communication is to inform the employees about the product launch. Well, yes, that was invalid, but it wasn't nearly as invalid as it would have been if they had said the purpose of this communication is to inform the employees I don't like Marmite. Absolutely invalid. Informing them about the product launch is a lot more valid, but it's not as valid as it could be. So what we're talking about here is a couple of continuums. And what we're doing is we're taking your current situation and driving it towards making your practices increasingly TFVP. So it's not something that's going to happen overnight. This is something that maybe you're looking at 12, 18, 24 months or something to actually get into this situation. However, once you've done it, and not just necessarily even in your current employment. If you move your career somewhere else, you can take this with you. You'll have the know-how to take TFVP practices with you wherever you go. So yes, it may take 12, 18, 24 months to get there, but that's you done for the rest of your career, however many more years you stay in internal communication. So does this make sense? Let's take a look and see if there are any comments. We may be having a problem finding the comments here. We'll have a go and see if we can see any comments. We'll do this overlay thing and see if any comments are popping up. And we can see none. Okay. This is interesting. We may be using this incorrectly. We hope we aren't. We're checking the private chat. We're looking everywhere else we can to see if there are any comments, and we can see none. So, okay, in that case, we're going to assume that everyone's kind of good with what we've covered, and move on to step 4. Step 4 is really kind of fascinating, because if you're going to make your practices TFVP, transparently fit for valid purposes, of course, that's only possible if you have a valid purpose for which your practices need to be fit. So how do we go about doing this? And this is something that a lot of people get very, very confused about. We find all sorts of people having all sorts of conversations about different types of internal communication. They will talk about change communication. They'll talk about leadership communication. They'll talk about strategic communication, whatever on earth that is. They will talk about internal marketing and internal PR, and it's just a mess. So how do we get a valid purpose for internal communication? Well, a couple of things that we need to look at. First of all, the fact that when it comes to professional communication, there are a number of different sort of arenas that we can look at. But one of the most important distinctions that can be useful to bear in mind is the difference between what we could call recreational communication and business communication. Recreational communications, things like books and magazines and theatre plays and TV shows and so on and so forth. And the point is that if you want to read Time magazine or go and see Les Miserables, whatever, question is, whose money do you have to spend to get to do that? Well, it's probably your own recreational money, isn't it? Okay, and whose time are you spending? It's your own recreational time, which means that for recreational communications to pay their way, as it were, all that needs to happen is the communicators need to get as many bums on seats, as many eyes on their product as they can, because recreational communications are the product, in effect. Is that true of business communication? Well, no, not really. If you are watching an ad break, who's paid to get that ad in front of your eyes? Well, the business has. Okay. So it doesn't quite work the same way, does it? And when it's an internal communication, do you pay to go on the intranet at work? Probably not. So we have a different dynamic that's at play when it comes to business communication. So people very often get this confused. And we saw something, and it's extraordinary that we saw this on LinkedIn just a couple of weeks ago, and it's something got loads of likes and shares, and we thought, oh, okay, wonderful. And this person had posted, they were making distinctions between internal communication and internal marketing, and we got a bit depressed. But hey, let's just share this with you because it's interesting that this is the kind of thing that some people think is valid. And so the purpose and focus of internal communication facilitates information exchange and collaboration among employees. Now, you can't say actually it doesn't. However, what happens if we ask the question, what's the purpose of that purpose? What's the purpose of facilitating that? It doesn't tell us. So it's not that it's wrong, it just doesn't go far enough. So we need to go further and look at this through these fresh eyes and look, first of all, at business communication. The purpose of business communication, we've already established that business communication only pays its way as a result of what people are doing once the communication process has actually happened. With advertising, with marketing communications, they want people to actually buy the product. If they do massive advertising campaigns and no one buys the product, then that's just money down the drain. And it's true with internal communication as well, that every type of business communication only makes sense if it directly or indirectly prompts and enables people to take or avoid actions either straight away or at some point in the future. Okay, that is a necessary aspect of internal communication and of all business communication. But if we ask the question, okay, but what's the purpose of that purpose? Then, and we keep asking it and keep asking it, eventually we'll get to the point that, well, ultimately, all business communication exists to help an organization fulfill its reason for existing. And we know that that's the top of the tree, really, because if we ask that question, well, what's the purpose of that purpose? What's the purpose of helping an organization fulfill its reason for existing? Well, the purpose of that is so it fulfills its reason for existing. You just start repeating yourself. So that's how we know we've got as high as we can. But what's fascinating for us is what happens if you actually put these two purposes next to each other. And you might think, well, in that case, that's the purpose of all business communication. So there isn't actually a difference between marketing and PR and internal. Really? Until we ask the question, how? How do these different forms of communication, these different audience actions actually help the organization fulfill its reason for existing? And when it's marketing or PR, well, what they're doing is they are creating brand promises in the hope that people will want to do business with the business. That's how they earn their keep, by creating those brand promises. Is that how internal communication does it? Absolutely not. Not even close. Internal communication is actually about delivering those brand promises and improving those brand promises and creating new brand promises. That's what internal communication is about. Delivery, nothing like just making a promise. So we can pull this together into a single statement of purpose for internal communication, which we believe, given everything, those workings out we shared with you, you will find as valid. That the purpose of internal communication is to help your organization fulfill its reason for existing by prompting and enabling employees, again, directly or indirectly, to consistently deliver and improve on your organization's brand promises as elegantly as possible. Why do we say elegantly? What do we mean by elegantly? Well, that is a sort of form of shorthand for efficient and effective and easy. Because yes, a business could do those things without great internal communication, but it would probably be way more inefficient. It might not be as effective as it could be, and it will almost certainly be a heck of a lot more hassle. So that's why we put this to you as the purpose of internal communication. Do you have any thoughts or questions about that? Let us know in the comments if you do. Oh, we have a comment by the looks of things. Tim, hi Tim. Big success in boardrooms with simplifying IC for business leaders. No feel do. Is our approach simpler or harder for non-comms leaders to understand? That's a great question. And we believe it's well, is it the question simpler or harder? Is it simpler or more complex? Is it easier or harder? We would say it may be more complex, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's harder. In fact, it might be easier because it can be clearer. A very useful distinction that we make is that if you were to look at two cars produced by the Ford Motor Corporation, there's the Ford Focus today, and once upon a time there was the Ford Escort. The Ford Focus took over from the Ford Escort. And if you were to ask which of those cars is simpler, well, the Ford Focus nowadays, it's got all sorts of sensors. It's got engine management systems. The car can pretty much park itself. It's almost self-driving. It's massively more complex than its predecessor, the old Ford Escort. But which is the easier to use? And which is the more reliable? Well, actually, again, it's the Ford Focus because of the additional complexity that makes it actually easier to use. Okay, so it's really important to make a distinction between simplicity and ease on the one hand and complexity and difficulty on the other. And the fact that very often simplicity can actually create difficulties and complexity can actually lead to easiness. So it's just a useful little sort of linguistic distinction to make. And we will let you be the judge of whether what we're proposing is easier or more complex or more difficult or whatever. We think it's actually easy enough. But as we go through this, you can actually make up your own mind, because what we're going to consider now is the question of how we actually make practices TFVP. How do we make it easy for leaders to understand this idea of the purpose of internal communication being fulfilled? And the way in which we do this is by, first of all, recognizing that there are some critical success factors that internal communication needs to meet. And there are 3 of them. So if we have as our purpose of internal communication, it's about helping your organization fulfill its reason for existing by prompting and enabling employees directly and indirectly to consistently deliver and improve on your organization's brand promises as elegantly as possible, that means that all internal communication practices need to optimally support employees' performance, obviously, and their well-being, perhaps slightly less obviously, but it does need to do it if you're going to do this as elegantly as possible, and also their desire and ability to add extra value. Can you see how those are kind of inevitable success factors that we can say if internal communication practices are not optimally supporting those, it's probably not as TFVP as it could be. So the fact that the internal communication is about fulfilling those brand promises as elegantly as possible, that's why IC practices need to optimally support employees' performance, well-being, and their desire and ability to add extra value. Does that make sense to you? We hope it does. And if it does, then we can move on to the question of, okay, how do we actually fulfill those critical success factors? We need to do that, but how? And this is where, again, a lot of people seem to be getting themselves confused, getting themselves into difficulties, because they keep trying to prove the value of internal communication. And they make a big mistake very often in talking about what internal communication can ensure. Well, internal communication can't ensure anything. This is something we learned when we trained with the British Standards Institution back in 2016, where we were learning how to put together practices that would comply with the British standard BS0. In case you didn't know, that something like 40% of all the world's ISO standards, like ISO 9000, whatever, they start their life as British standards. And there is a standard for developing British standards, and that is BS0. And we trained in this. In fact, there might be someone from the British Standards Institution on this call. Rosie, don't know if you're here. Say hi if you are. And one of the things we learned there was never, ever use the word ensure, because you cannot ensure anything. All you can do is maximize the possibility of. And so that's the way, the terminology that we learned to use then. And it's a similar situation when it comes to internal communication, that because internal communication pervades everything, then you can never say that any particular business success was entirely down to internal communication. Obviously, it played a part, but it can never take all the credit. However, it almost always can be given all the blame for something. People saying, well, that failed because the internal communication didn't work. People didn't understand X. They didn't know about Y. The message didn't get through about Z. That's why it failed. So our job is not necessarily to guarantee that everything goes right, because you can't. But what you can do is you can minimize the risks of things going wrong, maximize the possibility of things going well by minimizing the risks of them going wrong. Okay. So this is what we need to get into now, looking at how do you minimize the risks of those critical success factors falling apart. And we can do this by recognizing that alongside a series of critical risk factors, there's also a series of, critical success factors, there's also a series of critical risk factors. And so those three critical success factors are almost certainly going to be compromised if your internal communication practices, either in terms of how they're designed or in your ability to implement them, are resulting in communications that are rocking up late. That's going to be a problem, isn't it? People not having the information they need when they need it, or if they're being overwhelmed with irrelevant stuff they don't need and can't use, or if the information they're working with is inaccurate, or if it's unclear, they just don't know what does this mean? Is that not going to compromise their performance and their desire and ability to add extra value? Probably. And also, likewise, if they're disengaging. If you're reading a communication, you're thinking, hang on, is this talking to me or is it talking to someone else? So it feels like it's talking to someone else now, even though I thought it was supposed to be for me. That happens an awful lot and people become disengaged. They bin the communication and it fails. There's also an issue if communications are disorganized. People can't find their way to the information they need. That's true not only of individual communications, but of things like your intranet as well, if you haven't got enough budget or resource to actually manage that properly. There is a problem likewise with the intranet if stuff is inaccessible. The links are broken or the navigation isn't as clear as it needs to be. And similarly, if information is incomplete, there are gaps in the information. People don't know what they're supposed to do and they have to fill in the blanks for themselves. And also, of course, if the communication is unethical, if it's either asking for people to do things they shouldn't be doing, or the tonality is, abusive or something like that. So these are the critical risk factors that we have identified. And we can say that all of your working practices need to be designed in such a way as to minimize these risks, which means that what we can do is actually flip them on their heads and say, okay, if we don't want these risks to be hardwired into our internal communication practices, even if by default, because some of those practices are transparently unfit, then what do we want instead? All internal communication practices, if they are going to be transparently fit for valid purposes, need to be designed and implemented in a way which can maximize the possibility of the communications in question being timely rather than late, being relevant. Obviously, that's a biggie, isn't it? Of them being accurate, of them being clear, of them being engaging, of them being logically organized, of them being accessible, complete, and ethical. These are the criteria which we believe you can stand by with your leadership team. And we've made it easy for people to remember them, in fact, because they make a nice little mnemonic, which is the word trace-lace. So from here on, you can say, I want my practices to be trace-lace. I want you to support me in producing trace-lace internal communications, which means all my practices, everything that you're asking of me has to be done in such a way that it can maximize the possibility of trace-lace communications. Because again, the alternatives are simply indefensible. You cannot have justifiable confidence in internal communication practice, which is going to result in people receiving irrelevant communications or disorganized communications or incomplete communications. So they kind of, as we say, again, they back themselves into this corner where they surely to goodness are going to want you to be able to deliver this. Does this make sense to you? Again, if you've got any questions about this or you've got any comments, then let us know and we'll be happy to answer them. And what this does is it enables us to take another step when it comes to backing them into this empowering corner. Because if we look again, and you can do this with your own influence poverty list, go through it, and you can pick out anything that's on that list. This is part of the steps that you can take. This is step 8 on this journey. And you can say, okay, let's pick out a couple of these issues. Sometimes getting called in on projects at the last minute, or people not putting aside enough time to brief you properly. Let's imagine that that's something that you face. What can we do with that now? Well, we can take each and every one of these influence poverty issues, and we can now put them side by side with the trace lace criteria and say, okay, so getting called in on projects at the last minute, could that possibly put the timeliness of communications at risk? Of course it could. If you're having to rush, could that mean that some stuff might be inaccurate? Yeah. Could some things get missed completely, so it's incomplete? Yes, definitely. So that kind of piece of poverty that you're currently facing, you can now show is putting these trace lace criteria at risk if people won't put aside enough time to brief you properly. Well, if you haven't got time to know who you're even communicating with, is it possible you might end up sending communications with people for whom they're irrelevant? So that puts the relevance thing at risk. Might it be disengaging if they're not sure if you're talking to them or not? Yes. So it doesn't matter what you've got on your poverty list, you can overlay the trace lace criteria against it and say, right, these are the reasons why this current situation is actually putting these trace lace criteria at risk and why we have to change it. Does that make sense to you? So this is how we can actually enable people, you enable your leadership team to see that your current situation, if there's anything that is really frustrating and niggling you and stopping you from being able to do your job the way you know it needs doing, you can now actually put forward a really strong case for saying, this is why we need to change it. Okay. Any thoughts or questions about this, or is this still making sense to you? Because if it does make sense, then what this is telling us is that, remember, we looked at this earlier on, this influence abundance. And some people would very often describe it as living the dream. Well, it turns out that whatever you've got on your influence poverty list, if you flip it on its head and say, this is what we want instead, you will probably find that this dream you've been living toward, or you've been dreaming of for all this time, is nothing more than minimum hygiene standards. Which is kind of ironic, don't you think? That what you've been dreaming of all this time is nothing more than minimum hygiene standards, being able to do your job in a way which meets minimum hygiene standards. You're not asking for the world. You're only asking for the basics. That's probably your dream, just to be allowed to meet minimum hygiene standards, which is kind of ironic, don't you think? So that being the case, again, any thoughts or questions about anything we've covered so far? Because we've actually covered quite a lot. And so it'd probably be a good time to just do a quick recap of what we've been through. And we said there are 10 steps to IC influence abundance. So let's just quickly go through where we've got to so far. First thing, your first step is to map your influence poverty, your current influence poverty, and your desired influence abundance. That's step 1. Okay. And that means that you also include the benefits of you having that abundance, the benefits to you, the benefits to your organization, and the benefits to your leaders. That's step 1. Then with step 2, you can start sharing with your leaders that first thing we talked about last time, that transparently valid definition of internal communication, which, if they accept it, means it is the only business activity that everybody does, and that it pervades and influences the quality and efficiency of every other business activity. And as soon as they have accepted that, you are then in a position to ask that backing into an empowering corner question, which is, do you want to just have to cross your fingers and hope that this most influential of business activities is being done appropriately, or do you want to have justifiable confidence in it? As we said before, we find it very difficult to imagine they're going to say, we want to cross our fingers and hope, thank you very much. We are fairly confident they're going to say they want to have justifiable confidence. which starts those dominoes tumbling, because we can then talk about that TFVP paradigm. If they want to have justifiable confidence, they're going to have internal communication practices and support you in having internal communication practices which are transparently fit for valid purposes, because the only alternatives are completely indefensible. Transparently unfit, transparently fit only for invalid purposes, or unfit for invalid purposes. There's no way they can expect to have justifiable confidence in your working practices or the working practices of anyone else who's communicating in your business, which is everybody else, if they don't support the concept of TFVP practices, both in terms of how you have designed those practices and how you're implementing them. And that's the key bit. There are both of those pieces that need to go side by side, both the design of your practices and the implementation. We'll come back to that shortly. The next step is actually defining a transparently valid purpose for internal communication, which this is a summary of it, but ultimately it's about optimizing employees' desire and ability to deliver and improve on brand promises as elegantly as possible. That's really what we're talking about when it comes to the purpose of internal communication, which is quite unlike that of marketing and PR. Having done that, we can then say, okay, well, what are the critical success factors that inevitably gives rise to? And there are those three. It means internal communicating has to optimize employee performance, well-being, and employees' desire and ability to add extra value, which means that there are things that can put those critical success factors at risk, such as communications rocking up late or being inaccurate or disorganized or incomplete and all blah, 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 which means that your practices, if they're going to be TFVP, which your leaders have probably already acknowledged they want them to be, in that case, they need to be designed and implemented in a way which will make the outputs from those practices traceless. Because if they ain't, then they're not transparently fit for valid purposes, and your leaders can't have justifiable confidence in them. And now you've got the opportunity to say, okay, so what is the current situation compared to those traceless characteristics? And you can go through everything on your influence poverty list and map out, okay, what are the practices, my practices, does this affect my briefing process? Does this affect the channel mix? Does this affect enterprise social network protocols? Does this affect my ability to coordinate with external comms? What are all of the things that are adversely affected by your influence poverty? And are there certain things that you are missing? Things that you say, well, I would love to do these things, but I'm not allowed to. Okay, well, how does that, your inability to do certain things at all, how does that affect the possibility of traceless communications happening? What are the threats to traceless? And what this does, and this is the lovely thing that we've now arrived at, when you do this exercise, what you're effectively doing is pointing out how your current influence poverty is hurting your leaders' justifiable confidence. The two are inextricably joined at the hip. So there is no way, if your leaders want justifiable confidence, that they can possibly deny you having the influence that you need in order to deliver that justifiable confidence to them. So what does that look like? This is where we move on to step 9. What's it going to take to move you from where you are at the moment to where you want to be? And there are really 5 things that we've mapped out here. First of all, you need to come up to muster yourself. So it's about making sure that the designs of all your working practices, current ones and any new ones you want, are TFVP. There is absolutely no way you can justifiably expect your leaders to say, yes, we will let you do things the way you want, we'll let you have all the influence you want, if they can't see that your working practices are designed to be transparently fit for valid purposes. So you have to sort of make that, it's not a concession, but it's, you have to make the first move, as it were, so they can have justifiable confidence in the design of your practices in order for them to then have justifiable confidence in giving you what you want, which is going to be, first of all, perhaps a series of business policies, in putting them in place, which give you a mandate to implement your practices every time. So We talked last time about, managers who call you in and then say, oh, I can only give you 5 minutes for this brief. No, that's not acceptable. We need business policies, much as the finance team have when it comes to budget management. And those managers can't get away with saying, sorry, I haven't got time to do my budget returns this month. It's not your choice, mate. You don't get to decide that. You do this. This is how it's done. These are the rules of the game. And your leaders can only really realistically give you that kind of mandate if you have, first of all, proved to them that the design of your practices is TFBP and therefore demands these policies to be in place if they're going to be implemented effectively. Then, of course, you and your team may also need to upskill. So what's that going to take for everyone to have the skills necessary to implement those practice designs reliably, and also for you to have enough resource? That your team is big enough, you've got enough people to actually handle all the work that you need to do in a TFVP manner. And then finally, something we're going to put in brackets here, but it is something that will probably become quite an issue, or if it hasn't done so already, which is that with the rise of AI in particular and the ability of pretty much anybody to create limitless amounts of garbage, it may be necessary and useful for you to be in a position to set and oversee at least the line managers' internal communication practices, much as the finance specialists oversee their budget management. So these are the things that we reckon would be necessary for you to move from where you are now to where you want to be. Again, do you have any observations or comments or questions about this? Because when we were putting this session together, we were sort of thinking, okay, you've brought people to this point. Now, how would, if we were being presented this, how would we feel about doing these things? What questions might we have at this point? And we came up with 3 questions. You may have other questions, and please feel free to ask them. But when it comes to this whole thing of just getting started, because that's the key, isn't it? Actually just getting started on doing this stuff. It's all very well as long as it just sits in your head, but how do you get, that's the biggest challenge very often, just getting moving. Once you got going, then it's easier to keep things going. But our first question when it comes to getting started is, well, is this credible? Is what Rob has shared, does it actually make sense? Do I see how, if I were to follow these steps, I probably would stand a reasonable chance of gaining all the influence that I desire? And maybe not. We don't know. We're not going to put words into your mouth. But one thing that perhaps make it more credible as far as your business leaders are concerned would be if you could put together a credible business case and a plan for actually taking yourself from where you are to where you want to be. Can they actually see that? And that's why in the next session, we're going to be talking about putting that business case and plan together, because that's a big topic in itself. So if it is credible, if you sort of think, yeah, if I had a credible business case and plan as well as these things, then yeah, it would probably be worth doing. The second question we would have, if we were in your shoes, would be, well, yeah, it's actually quite a bit though, isn't it? It looks like it's quite a lot to do. So is it important enough? And then we thought, well, there's a simple way of thinking about that, and that would be to reconnect with your current influence poverty. How does that feel if you go to your own list of influence poverty, your own frustrations and niggles and if onlys and or whatever? How does that feel? And how would your influence abundance feel if you were to get to the end of it? What would that feel like? What would it be like waking up to this every Monday morning and every Tuesday morning, Wednesday morning, Thursday morning, and so on? Does that make it feel important enough for you? We can't answer that for you. That's yours to actually consider. But the third question that we would have is it practical? It's all very well. Yes, it's credible and it's important, but can I actually do this given everything else I've got on my plate? That's a long list. Well, is it? Because in fact, we've already covered off points 2 to 7, and we'll be getting to point 10 next time. So when it comes to getting started, where you are now, in fact, there are just 3 things that we would suggest you might like to consider doing between now and then, if you have time, if you're up for it, and we don't know if you are or you aren't. But number one, if you haven't already done it, document your current influence poverty and your desired influence abundance, and the benefits, the what's in it for you, what's in it for your organization, what's in it for your leaders. Document that, get it all out on paper or on screen, so you're not sort of just carrying it around in your head and it's clear. The second thing you can do is go through each of those influence poverty items and assess them against those trace lace criteria. So you're starting already to build that business case for saying, this is why we need to change these things. And the third thing you can do is map out your requirements. What specifically would you need to move from where you are now to where you want to be? That's still, a not insubstantial amount of work. So what we would like to suggest is that if you're in a situation where you sort of think, yeah, I can do that, I'm absolutely up for it, and that's not a problem, and I can go for it, then, as we said, brilliant, we will be happy to cheer you on. If, on the other hand, you look at that and think, yeah, I'd love to do it, but given everything else I've got on my plate, have I actually got what it takes? Or do I even, do I understand it clearly enough yet? Could I use a helping hand, a bit of hand holding to do this? In which case, send us a DM. We will be happy to do that hand holding if you would like that. Because we want you to make this happen. We want this to happen. We want internal communication specialists to have all the influence that they need. And it could be that you can view us almost like a personal trainer, because sometimes people get themselves personal trainers, and they say, and we have a mate who's a personal trainer, and she gets a bit cheesed off sometimes, because she says that people say that, the biggest value they get from having her as their personal trainer is that she gives them the motivation to just show up at the gym. And it's the showing up that is really, really important. And maybe that's something that we could be, just something that gets you to actually show up and do this. And we're happy to play that role. But as our mate also tells us, these people don't actually understand biomechanics like I do. So they don't know how much additional help they're getting. And some people do appreciate that as well. So if you're in a situation where you sort of think, well, yeah, I'd love to do this, but if I'm going to do it, it needs to be, I need to get through this work as quickly as possible, no mucking about, and for it to be as effective as possible, so I don't have to go back and do it again, and for it to be as easy, and enjoyable as it can be. And again, that's another way in which, if you wanted us to give you a helping hand with that, we would be more than happy to do so. So has anyone got any thoughts or questions about anything that we have covered this morning? Because we're nearly at the end. It has been a bit of a race through, and we know that. But if you've got any thoughts, you've got any questions, then do let us know now. Or if you've got questions that pop in your mind later and you want to send us a DM, please do that. And if you would like to leave a comment on LinkedIn, if you've enjoyed this session, you've got some value from it, then that would be brilliant. We would love to know what you think. So if there are no further comments, thanks, Tim, for yours. And we hope that we've answered your question. And yes, it's not as simple, perhaps, as the simple know, feel, do, but it is, given that you're on this call, we're guessing that's because you don't yet have all the influence that you desire, which suggests that the know, feel, do, even if it's simpler than what we share with you, hasn't actually got you what you want. And that what we've presented, we hope, is simple enough that you would be able to both actually get your leadership team to understand it, if you take them through it step by step by step, and that it will get you the answers that you're looking for, get you the influence you're after. Okay, so thank you very much indeed for your time. Hope you've enjoyed this session. As we said, leave us a comment if you want, send us a DM if you want, and we will catch up with you next month to talk about the business plan and the business case. Take care.